Hebrew lesson, April 23rd, part 4. Shalom, shalom.
Just to get you the big picture here. So will offer matches Leviticus 4:32, which is the word a lamb. It also matches Genesis 24:23, the man, and it matches Exodus 29:36, the atonements, HaKippurim, like Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonements. So the next word in Leviticus 7:13, will offer, that Hebrew word, the numerical value is 322, and it matches the atonements, a lamb, and the man. Then you go to offering, which is the next word in Leviticus 7:13, and it's 358. Now 358 is a very special number, because if we take the word Messiah, it's spelled Mashiach. Maybe you've heard that. That's a little vowel point. There's a yod. And then there's a final vowel there. And I guess there'd be a kamatz there. Okay, so Mashiach is 40, 300, 10, and 8. So 358. So we're dealing with, in Leviticus 7:13, Corbano, which is offering, has a numerical value of 358. So does Messiah. And here's a surprising one, but it shouldn't be, that in Genesis there's a prophecy, and it says, he shall crush the head of the serpent, and it shall bruise his heel, right? But it shall crush the serpent's head. This is the word for serpent in the Hebrew. Is Nahash. When it says in Genesis the serpent came to Eve, it says the Nahash, numerical value 358. So this is like when you were in school and you double check your work. Do you ever do that with the math problems and the teacher says double check your work? And people are like, wow, where did they come up with that? And they're double checking it, and they've got 10, 12, 20, 30 things that all match. So when they're interpreting that verse in Genesis where it says that's about the Messiah, it doesn't say it's about the Messiah, but in Genesis it says the seed of the woman, right, will crush the head of the serpent. So so you see Messiah and serpent both have a value of 358. So remember I said they're not identical meanings always, but they're connected in some way. And there's a strong connection between the Messiah and the serpent, because the Messiah comes to crush the head of the serpent. And then my favorite, I think it's my favorite. I have a lot of favorites. But the last word of the verse, Leviticus 7:13, is his peace offering. Sorry, that's a 300. The pen slipped a little. So 386. That's his peace offering, the last Hebrew word of Leviticus 7:13. So just in case you didn't get all the clues going through the verse and you need a little help putting it together, I'm going to write out a word you're familiar with. And this is actually found in the Bible, which I think is cool. It's the name of a person. But when they returned from captivity from Babylon, there's a little verse in Ezra 2, chapter 2, verse 2. And it says the name of one of the people that returned from Babylon was Yeshua. And this is how it looks in the Hebrew. And the numerical value of Yeshua is 386. So you get your 300 is the shin, You get your 10 is the Yod, you get your 6, and you get your 70. So 386 is Yeshua, and 386 is his peace offering. And just to put the icing on the cake, if you go to Deuteronomy, cake, yeah, there's no cake, but it's figurative. So Deuteronomy 15:6 has the phrase, and shall rule or reign, right? Depending on your translation in the English, it's mashal in the Hebrew, but it's and shall rule or and shall reign, and that Hebrew word has a numerical value of 386. So you get the last word of Leviticus 7:13 is his peace offering, Yeshua, and shall rule and shall reign. Hebrew thinking it's circular. It's cycles. So the cycles repeat. And the way that looks is the calendar, and I've shown some of that on Hebrew Shalom, where God had the tabernacle, and he gave specific instructions in Numbers chapter 1 and 2 of where the tribes were to camp. And if you start on the east with Judah, that's the first month of the year. That's Nisan that we're in right now. And then you have, as I said, Issachar is the second month, and then Zebulun. So as you go around the tabernacle clockwise, the tribes match up, one tribe for each month of the year. It goes in order. And it's deep, right? Because, for example, the ones we just got through, the word for north in Hebrew is Zephon, which means hidden, right? In the darkness, hidden. And so the 3 months that we just got done with Tevet, right? If you remember, and that was Dan, which was the time of chastisement, and Shavat, and then we went into Adar, and each one of these had a meaning to them, which I'm not going to get in depth right now, but they each also have a tribe that went with them, right? The tribe of Dan, and went with Tibet, for example, and Dan means judgment, but what it really means is to harvest. So what chastisement is, in Hebrew terms, is God's letting you reap a little bit of what you sowed. He's bringing to harvest what you've sowed. That's called chastisement in the Hebrew. So what God does is he says, I'm going to lift my hand, my protecting hand a little bit to chastise you by letting you feel the natural consequences of what you've sowed into, and that's called chastisement. In the Hebrew, that's the name where the name Daniel comes from, right? And the name Daniel means God is my judge, and what that means is God and only God is my judge. No man shall judge me, only God shall judge me. So the devil won't judge me. Man won't judge me. In other words, God's going to protect me from man and the enemy, from the devil's judgments. The only judgments that I'm going to receive, this is what the name Daniel means, is the chastisement of the Lord. I will not receive the false judgments of people or the judgments of the enemy against me, where he comes in the courts of heaven and hurls accusations against me. So Daniel's a really good name. It means I'm protected in God in such a way that the only thing that gets through to judge me is God's chastisements, which are always for my good and are only partial and temporary, right, for my good. So that's what Daniel means, and that's the tribe for the month of Tevet. The month of Tevet means goodness, the goodness of God shown in chastisement. That's the month of Tevet. On the north, which is Zavan, it's the hidden goodness of God, because it looks like it's not goodness because it's chastisement. But it's the hidden goodness of God. That's why it's on the north, Zavan. So it's deep. This is what I'm saying. So the calendar, we're talking about the broken clock syndrome. So in the Hebrew calendar, it's a lot deeper than just the holidays. Every month, even days of the week, they all have alignments in the spirit. And they've talked about this next revival is going to be a combination of the spirit and the word, right? So, and that's true. So what happens is when you have the word, and in this case, I'm referring to the word as being in alignment with God's written times and seasons, his calendar. When you're in alignment with that, and then the Spirit activates it, that's when you get a revival. That's when you get a move of God. So what's happening in the church quite often is somebody decides we're going to be hyper grace, let's say. All we want to focus on is grace. There's no judgment. There's no chastisement. There's none of that. We're going to rebuke it. We're going to rebuke the devil. We might even rebuke God if he tries to chastise us, because we're all about grace and nothing but grace. So now we're just going to call it 3. It could be any time on the clock. So when we reach the month of Tevet, which let's say is over here, where it's time for chastisement, the guy who's in the camp that's 3, the hyper grace, I reject this. I rebuke you, God. You can't chastise me. That's from the devil. He doesn't recognize it, so he fights what God's doing. So this is why I call it the broken clock. Twice a day, a broken clock happens to be in alignment with God. The rest of the time, it's a mystery why life is so tough, why God doesn't break through, why I don't get more victory. And it's all about coming into alignment with God. So I had the numbers. There was the first part of the lesson. And the second part of the lesson here is alignment. So what we're talking about is aligning with God's purposes and avoiding the broken clock syndrome where we try to build an Ishmael religion. We say, we recognize, here's a good thing to say that goes with this. The rabbis have an expression, the 70 faces of God. You've probably seen me post about this. And there's an idiom in the Hebrew. The face of God means the presence of God. It's a Hebrew idiom. So when Moses says, if your presence doesn't go with me, he actually says, if your face does not go with me, but it's actually plural. He says, if your faces, with an S, plural, do not go with me. So the way that works is, say I'm in a relationship with my wife. She has her angry face, right? She has her sad face. She has her happy face. She has the face that I refer to, which you have to experience. If you've experienced it, then you understand the look. I just call it the look, right? And the look is a very powerful face. But what happens with the broken clock syndrome is people experience a move of God. Let's say they experienced it at the 3. And I'm giving the benefit of the doubt that they're not just a bunch of rebellious nuts, but that they actually experienced God and they got stuck at 3 because they had a move of the grace of God. They were in alignment for the time when it was unconditional love. There was no chastisement. There was no discipline. It was all just unconditional love. So they said, wow, that's God, and that's all that God is. So they recognize, maybe we'll say that was 2 faces of God they saw in that move. So when those 2 faces of God show up, we're talking the presence of God. He's manifesting his angry face, his happy face. He's manifesting his grace face, his unconditional love face to them. So those 2 they accept. They build a denomination around it. They say, these are our 16 points that explain these 2 faces of God. Everyone has to believe it. And it's not that it's untrue, but these other 68 faces of God, whenever God shows up in those other 68 faces, that's when they're doing like in the vampire movie where they cross the fingers and hiss, right? Psst, get back. Rebuke you, Satan. That's not you, God. They don't recognize God because these other 68 faces they haven't experienced of God. So now they've limited themselves to these 2 faces. And likewise, let's not just pick on the grace people. Over here you could have we'll call them the chastisement people. And sometimes what happens is people, they'll levitate to that, not just because of an experience with God, but maybe that was their upbringing as a child. They grew up in a home where it was all discipline, all punishment, right? In the 1940s, they had Dr. Spock, and he changed child rearing. Right before that, child rearing was seen as you were a good father if you had a bedtime and you had rules and you had discipline for the child. That was the the chastisement. That was seen as being a good parent. Then Dr. Spock came along and he said, being a good parent now is grace. It's holding the child. It's showing the child unconditional love. It's all of that. So then we came to the self-esteem, to the grace. This has happened in our culture, right? So what's happened is, here's the chastisement. These are the people who, they grew up and they saw God work through discipline, right? We have our disciplines. We get up at 6 in the morning every morning and we pray and we fast, and God is there as a father to discipline us, to give us rules, to give us structure, and so on and so on. And they've seen revival come, like John Wesley would be a good example of that. Do you know why they called John Wesley and his followers the Methodists? Was because they followed methods. Because what Wesley and his followers did is they were on this Dan part of the clock. They weren't much on the grace. So if you were a Wesleyan in the old days, what you got was chastisement, structure, fasting, repentance, God's disciplining you, God's rebuking you, straighten your life out, get on the straight path. And John Wesley had great revivals. If you don't know your church history, it worked. It brought tremendous revival to the world, but it was in alignment with God here. So we'll say John Wesley saw two faces of God and passed that on to his followers. So now you have two groups in the church. This group saw these two faces of God, and this group over here saw these two, and they're cursing one another, not recognizing that in the Hebrew, God works in cycles, and as you go through God's calendar, God will show up to the church in one season as these two faces, and in another season as these two faces. And they don't contradict. It's the same God. In the same way that, if we put it in human terms, if I'm a parent and I have a son and a daughter, and I give them unconditional love as a baby, and I feed them and I hold them, but then as they get a little older, and I say, now I'm going to give them a bedtime, now I'm going to make them eat their vegetables, now I'm going to give them some discipline, I'm the same loving parent. It's not as though there's two gods, and this is part of what's been taught with replacement theology, is that there's a God in the Old Testament that's the chastisement, the angry God, the discipline God, and then there's a God of the New Testament that's the grace God. So people, because they have Greek thinking and it's linear, they come and they're teachers of advanced subjects, but they're not advanced in their understanding. And so you have a novice trying to teach advanced subjects, and it confuses people. Because they say, well, is it grace, or is it justice? Is it discipline? Is it chastisement? And the New Testament's very clear. The book of Hebrews says that God chastises us as a father in the New Testament. So this whole skewing of the doctrine is because people have seen two faces of God, and they don't want to experience the alignment as God goes around the clock, and accept that maybe we've only seen 4 or 6 or 8 faces, and he has 70 faces.
This is the end of part 4, to be continued in part 5. Shalom, shalom.